Okay. Good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Alberto Guerrero Velázquez, who is a PhD student here at UWA under Rob Wilson, and whose talk is entitled Trauma Lies in the Response, Revisiting the Concept of Psychological Trauma. Over to you, Alberto.
Thank you. Well, so thank you everyone for being here. I'm very excited about sharing these ideas with all of you. My PhD research is on philosophy of memory, and this work intends to be an application of the discussions that I'm developing in my thesis, but applied to a more everyday problem, which can be trauma. What I'm going to share today is based on an article that I recently wrote and that will be published soon in Spanish. And I would like to acknowledge that my research is funded by the Project Keeping Kinship in Mind, which I'm a part of, and the University of Western Australia. So yeah, this is working. So the word trauma has become very common in the last 100 years, and it is very used in common language and pop culture. It is common hearing people saying, I'm traumatized with a show, or he has a trauma, or that experience was traumatic. So it seems that we all have an idea or conception of what trauma is. There is also a growing industry around the detection and healing of trauma. You can find on the internet dozens of books and professionals offering detection and healing of trauma. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, 70% of Australians adults have experienced a traumatic event at some point in their life, and 11% of Australians experience PTSD in their life. So, but the concept of psychological trauma has been extensively studied in the history of psychology and psychiatry, resulting in multiple definitions from diverse schools. This makes it a polysemic concept that remains a subject of debate. One of the most significant discussions on the topic is the existing relationship between these three elements: the traumatic event, traumatic memory, and the traumatic response. As there is not a clear consensus on how they relate to each other in the definition and in the concept of trauma. So my aim on this paper is to show that the mainstream definitions of trauma, and therefore our common concept of psychological trauma, could be too dependent on one of the elements, which is the traumatic event. I consider that this dependence could be problematic to address relevant trauma-related effects that and that could be potentially harmful under certain theoretical conditions. My claim is that we have to migrate to a less dependent view and support definitions of psychological trauma that focus not on the event, but on the traumatic response. So this is going to be my outline today. First, I'm going to talk about the traumatic event and what I consider the causal position. Then I'm going to show some anomalies for the causal position. In the article, I discussed about 6 or 7. Today, I'm going to focus on the 3 that I consider more important. And finally, I'm going to provide some views about how we can migrate towards a post-causal view of trauma. Okay, first of all, I want to provide operational definitions for these 3 elements. So I'm gonna use the word event as an event that has the potential to altering the organism and cause traumatic responses. That's a traumatic event. For traumatic memory, I am understanding a memory trace or a mnemonic trace viewed as a modification of the nervous system that encodes a learning experience. And in other words, this is the record produced by an experience. And finally, I'm going to understand traumatic response as a series of alterations that a person experiences in response to trauma. Okay, so Now I'm going to analyze some influential definitions from prestigious organizations as a sample to show that the preeminence of the traumatic event in the mainstream conception of trauma. First, we have this definition from the Cambridge Dictionary of Psychology, and they define trauma as any event which inflicts physical damage on the body or severe shock on the mind or both. So as we can see, they focus the definition on an event. They are saying trauma is a kind of event. Then we have the second definition from the APA Dictionary of Psychology. They also define trauma as any disturbing experience that results in the following. So again, it's centered in an event. This definition from the Encyclopedia of Psychological Trauma, they define trauma as events that are emotionally shocking or horrifying, which threaten or actually involve deaths or a violation of bodily integrity, right? So again, they define trauma as a type of event. Finally, this definition from Bessel van der Kolk, who is a very influential psychologist in the study of trauma. And on an interview, he defines trauma, and he says trauma is an event of certain types, an event that overwhelms the central nervous system and changes the way you remember and react. And finally, according to the DSM-5, one of the diagnostic criteria for the diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in individuals over the age of 6 is direct exposure to a traumatic event. Even if this manual doesn't provide a specific definition of trauma, it suggests that its diagnosis requires a presence of a trauma event. So, as we can see from this sample of definitions, the concept of psychological trauma relies strongly on the presence of a traumatic event. Traumatic event, under this point of view, serves as the antecedent to the association where the traumatic memory and the traumatic response are consequence from the existence of a traumatic event. So this is what I call the causal view of psychological trauma, and looks like this. If the question is, where is trauma? The answer from a causal position will be in the event. The event is the antecedent, and traumatic memory and traumatic response are consequence from this antecedent. So now I'm going to explore some anomalies that challenges this causal position, right? And to introduce these anomalies, I'm going to analyze the role of the traumatic memory and its relation with the traumatic response. Okay, if we say that the memory is traumatic, we're saying that there is a specific type of memory that has the quality of being traumatic or is associated with trauma. According to Squire's 1987 influential taxonomy, our long-term memory is divided into two subsystems, which are declarative and implicit. I will focus first on the implicit memory. Implicit memory involves processes that capture and associate contextual stimuli at a subconscious level and links them with emotional, physiological, and behavioral responses. We become aware of the existence of implicit memories through behavioral responses, typically involuntary. Two typical examples of these are driving a car or riding a bicycle. So if there's a traumatic memory and this memory is an implicit memory, it would be expressed through behavior. For example, a person who experienced a car accident might feel intense anxiety or panic when entering a car or driving again, even if they don't consciously recall specific details of the accident. In other words, under a causal position, the changes in implicit memory are the evidence of the existence of a traumatic event. The problem and the first anomaly starts when one doesn't remember any specific traumatic event directly related to those behavioral responses, or when that event hasn't happened at all, like this case. Several studies have found that individuals can develop traumatic reactions through exposure to media and social discussions of disasters and large-scale negative events, known as anticipatory stress response. This happened even if they weren't directly exposed to the traumatic events or aren't related to involved victims, both criteria for a diagnosis of trauma of PTSD according to DSM-5. Therefore, the traumatic reactions for anticipatory stress disrupts the causal relation and represents an anomaly for the causal position. Now, I will analyze the second division of memory, which is the declarative memory. So this memory is divided into two subsystems, which are semantic memory, which we use to remember general information about the world, and episodic memory, which we use to recall past events. Episodic memories have three distinctive characteristics. One, they can be simulated or represented through episodic remembering. Second, they are complex, or they recreate an episode and integrate multimodal content. And third, they are reportable as they belong to declarative memory. So, if it's true that the traumatic event plays always a direct causal role in the formation of episodic traumatic memories, as the causal position claims, then such memories should always be representable, complex, and reportable. However, this is not always true. Several individuals experience difficulties in partially or fully recalling details of a traumatic experience. In this case, people experience an event and exhibit a trauma response, but they are not able to remember, to recall any particular detail of this memory. So, we have an event as established by the causal position, but not a memory of it. We could have a traumatic response, but the supposed traumatic experience that explains it remains unknown since there are not memories of it. The absence of a traumatic memory, of a traumatic episodic memory, breaks the causal chains again. And this absence is directly related with the last of anomalies that I'm going to be talking today. And this is the most important for me as well, which is the existence of false memories. Some individuals with trauma response develop false memories of traumatic events. This is an anomaly to the causal view because individuals can exhibit symptoms consistent with psychological trauma. They have developed memories that explain those symptoms, but they have no actually experienced an event. Those memories are what we consider false memories of an event that never happened. So the causal relationship is broken again. I want to give special attention to this last anomaly because it demonstrates why maintaining a causal view could be potentially harmful under certain theoretical conditions. So, research on false memories is strongly associated to the concept of repressed memories. This term has been used to refer to supposed long-term memories that become inaccessible to conscious retrieval due to what is considered a repression mechanism, which implies becoming unable to remember the traumatic event. So proponents of the existence of repressed memories argue that their content has psychopathological potential, making it necessary to recover them in order to treat the trauma. This implies using therapeutic methods to make them accessible, such as hypnosis or regression. This procedure supposes that the traumatic response is an evidence of the existence of a traumatic event that remains repressed and must be found. However, critics of the idea of the repressed memories have argued that there is a very little empirical evidence for the existence and that there are for the existence of the repressed memories, and that there are alternative explanations, and they are sufficient to account for the forgetting of traumatic episodes without invoking the concept of repression. As the brigade indicates, the mental architecture model that gives rise to the notion of repressed memories, proposed by Freud, which posits two independent cognitive systems, the conscious and the unconscious, lacks experimental evidence or has little no one. But one of the most significant concerns in this discussion is that supposed repressed memories recovered through therapeutic procedures may actually be false memories generated by those same procedures. This means that the need to find such hidden memories guided by the idea that they must exist as traces of a traumatic event could be what actually generate them. So diverse research have found that under certain therapeutic conditions, many patients have developed memories of an event that they did not experience, even developing memories of traumatic or overwhelming experiences. So one of the most well-known cases is the case of Nadine Kuhl, deeply investigated by Elizabeth Loftus. Probably you're familiar with this case. So in 1986, Nadine Kuhl decided to seek therapy from a psychiatrist to address the traumatic symptoms that were afflicting her. So Nadine had what could be interpreted as a traumatic response. So according to the causal position, this traumatic response must be an evidence of the existence of a traumatic event, some event that happened, and we have to find a memory of this event. So, as the event was not evident, Nadine had no memories of it. Over the course of 5-year treatment, her therapist insisted that Nadine could not improve unless she unearthed what he considered as repressed traumatic memories. To achieve this, she underwent repeated sessions of hypnotic regression and guided imagery. And additionally, she was also subject to an exorcism and therapy sessions that lasted 15 hours. Over time, Nadine began to recall terrifying images. She visualized her participation in a cult, the consummation of babies, sexual assaults, relations with animals, and witnessed the murder of her 8-year-old friend. Her psychological health deteriorated progressively. And additionally, she started to believe that she had more than 120 personalities, ranging from children and adults to angels and even a dog. All of these, according to the therapist, supposed to be memories that had remained repressed as a consequence of abuse suffered during her childhood. However, Nadine eventually began to question the veracity of these memories. She decided to end her treatment with the therapist and managed to regain much of the stability she had lost. Eventually, she found that her therapist had employed suggestive memory recovery procedures to convince her that she had suffered terrible abuse. So in 1997, she won a malpractice lawsuit, obtaining $2.4 million. Unfortunately, Nadine's case has not been the only one. The literature in repression of false memory report many others that show similar characteristics. What I want to stress here is that behind this necessity to find a memory as an evidence of a traumatic event, there is a strong causal position that leads patients and therapists to recover the supposed repressed memories at all costs. So I have presented by far 3 trauma-related effects that challenge the causal view of psychological trauma. So in summary, it seems to me that focusing on the traumatic event is highly problematic in defining trauma. In many cases, the traumatic event only matters because it helps causally explaining the traumatic memory and the traumatic response. But a direct, strong causal relationship between them shouldn't be a necessary condition for conceptualizing psychological trauma, and on certain conditions, it can be even potentially harmful. So, now I'm going to try to provide some thoughts about how we can migrate towards a post-causal view of trauma. I believe that the discussion in causation in memory could suggest alternatives for this new relationship between traumatic event, traumatic memory, and traumatic response. One of the most influential, well, this is a discussion very common and very well known in the philosophy of memory. I'm going to summarize it. Yeah, it's an ongoing discussion and a very long discussion, so I'm just going to summarize it. One of the most influential accounts of memory is Martin and Deutscher's causal view. So in broad terms, this proposal suggests that a person legitimately remembers a past event only if 3 conditions are met. If the person experienced the event when it occurred, if there is a causal connection between the experience of the event and the representation of it during remembering, and this causal connection is given by a memory trace. Yes. So we experience the event, we record that event in a memory trace, and then we represent that event through recollection, right? That's the standard view of memory. And if people are capable of mentally representing the event. So a proposal is considered a causal theory of memory precisely because of the condition 2. This means that a remembered memory can only be legitimate if it's originated by a memory trace, which has previously codified in a single event. The causal position, however, has faced numerous criticisms in the philosophy of memory. The most significant is its limited capacity to explain the constructive character of memory, of remembering, which means that the memories that we evoke usually integrate information from various sources and various experiences, not only from the experience that we are trying to remember. As remembering seems to be a constructive process, the second condition proposed by causalists is broken. However, we are still able to remember pretty well multiple events and to qualify those memories as legitimate. We don't need for real that there's a causal connection between the event and the memory codified in a single memory trace. We use multiple experiences to remember events. So, as a result of this criticism, other theories have emerged. And one of the most important is the simulative hypothesis of memory, which is viewed as a post-causal view of memory because it doesn't depend on this causal relation. According to this hypothesis, remembering an event consists in flexibly combining past experiences into a simulation of that event. The product of this simulation is what we experience as a memory. The simulation theory addressed much better the constructive character of memory since focus much more on remembering as a process itself and not necessarily dependent of a causal connection between it and the event. And accept that the sources of a remembered memory can be multiple, not only one. So I believe that the discussion on causation in memory can provide significant insights to migrate to a post-causal view of trauma, especially on 3 aspects. First, breaking or decreasing the causal connection. Second, focusing on the cognitive process, or in this case, on a traumatic response. And third, adopting a constructive view that can be multi-causal, not caused by one single experience. So, Therefore, we need to abandon this strong causal view in the definition of trauma, and I propose that we can do it migrating to this, right? In this view, I'm considering the traumatic event just one of the multiple elements that are related to the occurrence of trauma, not only one. Yes, sometimes the traumatic event is not going to be there, but we are going to have a traumatic response, right? So in this case, what I'm proposing is that the traumatic event can help us to explain this traumatic response, but if the traumatic event is not there, there's still a response. There is something that people are feeling, symptoms of trauma that need to be healed. And even if we don't find a traumatic event there, we have to focus on this part of the process, on the part where people are experiencing traumatic responses and have traumatic memories sometimes of that event. So I believe that overcoming the strong causal view involves aligning with more ecological explanations of trauma that incorporate a range of other factors to contribute to the development of the psychological trauma. So, as Gieler argues, trauma is an unique and personal experience of an event or enduring conditions that become traumatic when they exceed an individual's capacity to cope. So for her, trauma should be defined from the survivor's experience, as it's the organism itself that truly determines when and how trauma response develops. So considering this perspective forces us to define trauma not merely as an event of certain type with specific characteristics, but as a response that an organism have to various individual, social, environmental conditions occurring within a specific framework that proves highly overwhelm that organism. Okay, this is why from the three elements I've discussed, I believe that the traumatic response is the one that more relies on the patient's experience. Therefore, it must be the element that has a more prominent role in the definition of psychological trauma. The above implies directing attention to aspects such as behavior, phenomenology, or physiological changes that a person experiences in response to a stimulus or a series of stimuli associated with psychological trauma. We should support, I believe, the adoption of trauma definitions that first reflect the importance of the traumatic response. And this importance must be reflected in therapeutical approaches that also focus in this third element. So I believe that this is not only a much more effective way to address these anomalies or these effects that represent anomalies for the causal view, but also is much more centered on the survivor's experience. So at the end of the day, improving the quality of life of trauma survivors is what leads us to discussions like this. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alberto. Questions?